Good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening. Wonderful. So my name is Morris Mtombeni. I'm a member of faculty here at Gibbs. I do have a fancy title, but enough of that for today. I am very excited to see so many people here this evening. I'm sure some of you are giving up on year-end parties at work. Is that right? Yes? No? No? Whichever. You will not be disappointed. Just to be clear, this is not a book launch. So I have it on good authority that we will have our lights on for the whole evening. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for us to have a conversation, initially an intimate conversation amongst new friends, and then a broader conversation amongst all of us here. Of course, we have a friend that is still missing. I'm told he has not been hijacked, so he's on his way. So Mr. Fick will join us shortly. The way I would like to run this evening is just to remind us what is the brief. It's one thing to look back and make sense of the world through the rearview mirror. We're trying to make sense of the world going forward, rather. And that's a much harder job to do. And in order to do that, I thought I'd create some structure to our conversation, start with a thought experiment, and with your permission, allow me to talk you through what that structure will look like. Firstly, when we look at what we've been through, particularly over the last 5 years, you could imagine that there are really two schools of thought. The one school of thought is that we have been gripped by criminals. We have been captured by criminals. So the criminal argument is very strong, very alive, and many of us can really speak freely about that criminal argument. However, equally, there's another argument, an alternative analysis to what we've been through, and that is the political argument that what we've been experiencing is not an example of criminality, but an example of a political project. What I've asked my fellow delegates, my fellow guest speakers, to help us to do is to say, we are going to lean into Alvin Toffler, which when he wrote in 1970, he said the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those that cannot read and write, but rather those that cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. All right? So part of that learning and unlearning and relearning requires us to consider both arguments, both the criminal project argument and the political project argument. So I'm going to ask my peers to begin walking with me along this lane of the criminal argument, and then we will switch lanes and together walk down the lane of the political argument. It doesn't mean, as we're doing this thought experiment, that they necessarily believe in either one. At the end of our conversation, before we open it up to the panel, I'm then going to ask them to reveal to us which of those arguments they feel is the most compelling. Yes? And then we'll continue on that basis together. So the idea is that we'll be in conversation amongst the four of them or 5 of them together with me facilitating for about 50 minutes up to 7 o'clock. And then we'll open up in an improvisation, free flow jamming, so to speak, till 7:30. Of course, if you want an encore, you can just clap and say, we want more. We want more. Then the louder you clap, then the more minutes we can give them. Are you comfortable? Can we practice the clapping? Now, gentlemen, that one is for you. So you can say whatever you like now. You've had your ovations, and all will be good. I must say I acknowledge that this is a manual, as opposed to a panel. And that is largely because the problems that we have in this world really, I don't believe, are created by women.
That's good.
So it's a manual by design, not by accident. So allow me to introduce some people that go without, they don't really need much introduction. I begin here on my left with a man who buys ink by the barrel, a lesson that our politicians should learn, and none other than Mr. Jacques Poe. Let's give him a round of applause. So this is first edition book. I got it signed. Jacques says he'll also sign the second edition book, which you might have bought last week, and some will be on sale at the end of the show. Is it a show? I'm on TV, so I think it's a show. At the end of the conversation. So please go and harass Jacques for a signature at the end of this conversation. Next to him, I was told when I left the business world that those that can't do teach. Then I later learned that those that can't teach consult. So allow me to introduce to you
Not here to be insulted.
to Adam Cracker, that was a crack of a move, the Chief Executive of IQ Business. And then next, and yet another gentleman who needs very little introduction. He is a former miner, former financier through Old Mutual, and now is a drug dealer. Sorry, is a chairman of a pharmaceutical company.
I'm going to be honest.
Mr. Kuseni Dlamini. And finally, just to personalize, I went to a high school. It was a hippie school. We didn't wear a uniform. Smoking dacha was a passage through life. I didn't do it, but others did it. And I only recently learned that so did our next participant. He too is a former graduate of my high school. Doesn't exist anymore. It's now a very religious place, but at the time it was called Woodmead High. And I remember one of my crowning moments is having Bishop Tutu arriving to talk to us in the 80s and saying he doesn't believe in his lifetime that he'd experienced the kind of schooling that Colin and I went through. And it was wonderful to see a few years later when that indeed in his lifetime he's had the pleasure of experiencing what a truly free South Africa looks like. But this gentleman is no longer a hippie. He's Mr. High Finance, and I'm sure he'll tell us later how it is possible for people like him to navigate this very complex environment without getting their hands dirty. Mr. Colin Coleman. So allow me to pose the first question, and possibly you could take us into your guitar, Jacques, in asking the question, which is, please help us to understand how you believe this criminal project came about, based on the research that you have done.
Well, I think the most important aspect is that in order for criminality to well, first of all, in order for criminality to succeed, but in South Africa, it didn't just succeed, it blossomed. You have to, and this is what Jacob Zuma did, you have to destroy the capacity of the law enforcement agencies to investigate. And I basically talk about the Hawks, Crime Intelligence, SARS, the NPA, and State Security. Basically, they have all been captured, which is a word I sometimes have a problem with. Captured in the sense that the president of the country has enormous power to appoint. Now, I think when we wrote the Constitution in the early 90s, we wrote it with somebody like Nelson Mandela in mind, because we knew he was not going to abuse power. So we allow the president to appoint the heads of all the law enforcement agencies. He appoints the commissioner of SARS, and he appoints the commissioner of police, and the head of the NPA, and whatever. Never imagining that someday we're going to sit with someone like Jacob Zuma, who has to protect himself, his friends, and his cronies. And not only protect himself against the fraud and corruption charges that we all know about, but also sort of like acts that emanated from after he became president. We also talk about his sons to design a net with, and we talk about his cronies, the Pandays and the Guptas and people like that. So in order to protect criminality, in order to shield criminality, Zuma has basically destroyed the law enforcement agencies, and the pattern started not long after he assumed power in May 2009, whereby there were still credible people heading the law enforcement agencies, people like Ivan Pillay, Opa Magashule, Anwar Dramat, I mean, it's names we all know. And in my book, I have a long list of names of very credible, very skilled, very dedicated civil servants that became a victim of Zuma's attempt to purge the law enforcement agencies. And we're sitting with the result today. I mean, I can go on forever about this.
That made me pause you there. You know, I must say, I've learned that you don't have to respect a person, but it's a good idea to respect the office. So for the rest, I'd say we can call him President Zuma. Jacques, you buy ink by the barrel, so I won't force you, but I would propose you also consider calling him President Zuma, but that's just my suggestion. Adam, this narrative of President Zuma and his ilk being bad on the one hand, and others like former Minister Godin and Ivan Pillay, Obama Magashule, all of them being good, it's quite a strong narrative. As a consultant, do you believe that it's a helpful argument for business people to use to make sense of what is happening in the operating environment?
Maurice, I think it does make sense. I think as we've seen the process that Jacques talks about and the timeline, that the length of time that we've seen in terms of the project that has been underway has actually been enabled by organisations that have been highly regarded in the marketplace previously. And when we think about the role of consulting organisations or audit firms or legal firms that clearly have overstepped the line in terms of their business activities in the pursuit of growth and value, that really brings, I think, some colour to the situation. And it's not only a local issue. I think we would be foolish to consider that the actions that we've seen in the South African marketplace are restricted to this region, to this geography. And indeed, when we think about the involvement of McKinsey and Trillion, which is probably one of the most visible connections, that a R1 billion deal or a 1.6 billion rand deal is not something that gets signed off locally by the local partnership. There are controls and risk management structures, and a deal of that nature would have to go through international approvals, and indeed might even go to the very top of the organisation. And so I think we've got to consider the impact that the criminal activity that has taken place in South Africa could have on those organisations that have been complicit or have been, as I say, in the pursuit of growth and their business goals, have decided potentially that South Africa is a far off and distant location from headquarters, and our business practices in that marketplace are different, and they can drop their standards and their values and morals within their organization.
So thank you. So Kuseni, if we could piggyback on that, so clearly we are talking about state governance gone wrong and interacting with corporate governance. So if I could lean into your role as somebody who plays in this world of corporate governance and ask you to reflect, again, the same question, does this dichotomous argument of making some people good and some people bad, is it really helpful to your role and others like you that are trying to govern organizations to ensure that they make a contribution in society? Is it a helpful analysis? Is it a helpful framework?
I think it is helpful. It is contributing to unpacking a problem that faces the country, and a problem that we should all be ashamed that it happened in our midst. When you look at the scale, the industrial scale corruption that you've seen through the Gupta leaks, it makes me wonder, where was I when all this was happening? What was I doing? And again, it just indicates the failure of institutions. And I think, looking at it from a governance point of view, when governance fails, it opens up the space for evil elements to really manipulate state institutions, manipulate resources, or manipulate shareholder resources in the case of the private sector. I think what we've gone through really gives us a wake-up call as we move it to 2018, that we have to be wide awake every day, that all of us in the institutions where we operate must be activists against corruption, must be activists against wrongdoing, and we have to be able to expose it. But also we need to create the right ecosystem where whistleblowers are actually not just protected, but they are also rewarded for being whistleblowers. And in the US, the system, the SEC had a system where whistleblowers will get a portion of the value of the corruption that they exposed. But the other key thing is what my colleague Adam has just mentioned, the role of the private sector. All this has happened not just in isolation. Business has been a factor in it. And we, as business people, we have got to ask ourselves what kind of ethics underpin the way in which we create shareholder value, and what is it that we are prepared to do and not do to pursue shareholder value. And it's very saddening that you have got blue chip companies that have been implicated in this scandal, and these are highly respected global names. But what is heartening from a South African point of view is that not even one South African company has been caught in this saga. You talk Bell Pottinger, it's British. Talk McKinsey, it's USA. KPMG in USA. SAP is Germany. And as South African corporates, maybe we have got to pat ourselves in the back that at least we really believe in anti-corruption and we don't pay bribes. And in the companies that I chair,
no, I must challenge you there.
We have got very strong, very strong ethics.
You know, let's lean into some of the evidence I'll come to you now, Colin. So we have all the banks in 2016, correct me if I'm wrong, closing down the accounts of the Gupta-linked entities. Is it before? 2016, thereabout?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I don't ever recall any of them offering to pay back the money. Mm-hmm. And so is it okay for them to keep the profits of these ill-begotten gains? Should we say, yes, well done, you made your money legitimately even though it was illegal money? Or should they also say, do the right thing, we also paying back the money? Just a question to you.
Credit to the South African banks, because they're very proactive in taking very difficult action, and they came under severe political pressure for doing that. In fact, they alerted us as a public about what was happening behind the scenes, which we didn't know, because as soon as they started doing that, questions were being asked, and as indeed questions had to be asked about the motives and the real reasons, and it turned out that there were indeed certain substantive concerns that they had. So I think we have to inculcate a culture of fighting corruption, building strong institutions, having a strong media, having people like Jacques and investigative journalists doing their part, strong think tanks, strong state security apparatus that is not captured, that is there to fight crime without fear or favor, and to really protect the interests of the people of South Africa and uphold the constitution of this country.
I must congratulate you for holding the line and sticking to the criminal argument. Well done there. Colin, if I may ask you maybe to reflect either as yourself as an organization being part of a multinational corporation, or on behalf of other multinational corporations or foreign investors in this country, does the good and evil argument really help them to make sense and to operate in this environment?
There's this friend of mine at university on the SRC with me in the 80s. He was quite brilliant. He used to say to these kind of questions, very good question, next question, please. I actually don't want to talk about that. It's sort of the sexy stuff about multinational. I think I just want to go back, if you don't mind, Morris, to... I'll come back to it. But I just want to go back to this central question of, so
that's how investment bankers make money. They don't do what you ask them to do. They do what they want to do, and they still charge you.
I also want to remind you, President Clinton is one of my heroes in history. Turned a massive deficit into a surplus. And like him, I didn't inhale.
But you smoked.
Keep it clean. Keep it clean.
The patronage system, to this question of a political criminal project, the patronage system, when you describe it, is actually a system, in terms of its definition, I've thought a lot about it, and Jacques has lived it, is a system whereby the political elite effectively construct a distributive system of resources, of national resources through the state, to the political party constituents sufficient for those political party constituents to keep them in power. And it's a massive organization, it's a political organization to distribute resources in what we would call a corrupt, but it's a systemic way. And that's what the patronage network of the ANC, that faction within the ANC that wants to keep that patronage network alive, that's what they're doing. And they're doing it in a very organized form. I also don't want to allow the impression to be created that this is sort of a dispersed set of criminals in the state who sometimes, dip in and dip out of an otherwise clean system. It's actually what's so fascinating about Jacques' book, which I've still got to read in detail, is it describes an organized shadow state which effectively uses these state resources in this manner. And obviously that's the Angola and various other countries' experience, that the party that effectively controls the state uses the state and the political elite structure to keep itself in power through this distributive mechanism. And entities like Eskom, and I would say it was fascinating. I came home one night, 8 o'clock, and I watched till 11 o'clock at night. If you actually watch the denial at that Eskom inquiry, and at the same time, all political parties, I think, uniformly trying to unpack it, it was fascinating to see, and to see that in one sitting between Sotsi and the former chairman and Minister Lynn Brown, they had diametrically opposite stories, which rendered impossible but for the commission to conclude that one of them was lying. And therefore, one of those eminent people had perjured themselves on television in front of the public. And it's coming back to your question about the multinationals. It's really, really difficult in a country like South Africa, where this has been an organized state machinery, to manage yourself in such a way is that you're detecting, you're really on your toes, and you're able to work out what is compliant with FCPA, what is compliant with global reputation, global values, global principles, and to see ahead of time. It's very easy to go back in history now and say, oh, Eskom is an entity you shouldn't have done business with. But sitting 2 years ago, in my seat in Goldman Sachs in South Africa, with a large amount of financing that one can do with an entity like Eskom, who's telling you what is right and wrong when you have a board, a system, a chairman, a CEO, a CFO, who in retrospect look completely corrupt, but then are authorized by the highest levels of the state. And you've got to work out. Now, I would just say one or two things. One is, when I joined Goldman Sachs in 2000, I joined from JP Morgan. It was fascinating because we sat in this group, and a very prominent Goldman Sachs partner, then by the name of Peter Weinberg, who's then since left, the very famous Weinberg family, said to us, he said, you know, they were all new recruits into Goldman Sachs. He said, you know, you're all here because you are the best people we could find for the positions you occupy. The best global talent, and we're unbelievably proud that you've decided to join Goldman Sachs. But I want to tell you, he said, that each one of you could do more harm to this firm than you could do good. And you'll do that harm by destroying the reputation of Goldman Sachs. It takes 100 years to build a reputation and one stupid act to destroy it. And you see it with, really, it's painful for me to watch what happened with McKinsey in this country. Because I've seen, when I was at Standard Bank, and I've seen McKinsey start in this country. I've seen them build with blood, sweat, and tears this fantastic business in the continent. And friends who are at McKinsey, who I've known a long period of time, who've been closely associated with this, actually one is almost disbelieving that they could earn $100 million on a contract with Eskom and with Transnet in this manner. It's, you know, one disbelieves it. But at the same time, I can tell you, sitting in Goldman Sachs dealing with these things in the moment, it's ultimately the culture, the obsession with reputation, it's the controls in the organization, it's knowing when to elevate and deal with issues. And I promise you, I warned every single one of my London, New York, and South African colleagues 2 years ago that anything to do with state-owned enterprises, they were not allowed to touch without my counsel. And I had a very clear suspicion of the set of things. You know, Pravin, connect the dots. And the dots were not there. Not all the dots were there. And that's what...
we'll come back to that in session 3. We'll come back to that. Thank you. Mr. Fick, welcome. You know, one of my colleagues, when I was in Nigeria, and they said, the problem with time is not those that arrive on time. So not those that arrive late, is rather the ones that arrive on time, because time for us is a guide. It's not a fixed point, and you've proved it to us again today that we're in Africa. So welcome, Mr. Fick. Just to remind you, we started the conversation, we're in one lane, and that lane is the criminal lane. We'll switch shortly into the political lane. And just to do a quick summary, the criminal lane is that state capture, the foundations of state capture is in institutional capture and denuding the institutions of talent. And that this makes it very difficult for corporations, particularly management consulting corporations, to really guide their clients to operate in this environment. That it's very important for business to be that shining light, to be ethical, and in particular, South African business has shown itself to be a very positive force, a force for good. And then, of course, Colin did a bit of a tsotsi move where he straddled between lanes. He moved a little bit into the political lane and pulled himself back into the criminal lane, and pointing out that it's very complicated, it's very complex. And my sense is, to summarize, you need somebody who's deeply immersed, who understands the environment, to be able to guide the peers from all over the world in that very complex environment. So I now hand over that summary to you, Mr. Fick, and say, question that everyone has been answering is, often the narrative is there are good people and bad people. There are good events and bad events. And this book, part of it does describe it that way, not all of it. Part of it describes that narrative of good and bad. The question is this a helpful way to make sense of what's happening in our environment? Mr. Angelo Fick.
So just to begin, I must apologize for being late, but while this discussion on state capture is going on, there's actually one happening in Parliament right now. So I had to straddle, like Colin, many lanes. I think it's never useful to have binaries, other than in computer coding, where it's absolutely essential. But like any critic who comes late, you're always looking at the corpse that everybody else has tried to resuscitate. And I think we, living in this period, have to also begin to realize that we're coming to what is increasingly a corpse in the making when it comes to capitalism of the old style. That the system as a whole globally has been going through an ongoing crisis for longer than just the 2008 crisis. And so when we start thinking of good people and bad people, the question is, whom is the good supposedly for? Because if you think the good is for the people, that's one set of answers you're going to get about who is good, and what kind of institution would be good. If you're asking what is good for the people who need to make profit, the answers to that are not as simple as there are simply good people and bad people. Because if you can make profit off capturing a state, then it's good for you that a state is captured. If you can no longer make profit off a captured state because somebody else has captured it, then of course it is bad for you. So if we go through South African economic history, the kind of capture that we're talking about now is, of course, new and vulgar and crude and all of the terms that we've seen before. But Merle Lipton, an eminent economic historian of South Africa, has traced for us the kinds of capture of the South African state and the complicated dance between capital and apartheid and colonialism that we now would like to deny or somehow diminish or minimize. But it's not just a question of good and bad, because that implies that it's something about the people and their intrinsic value as human beings, their ethical systems, rather than their functionaries in a system or their functions in a system, as Noam Chomsky so eminently pointed out when we talk about the backroom boys and girls that, you know, justified the Vietnam War, that straddled state and corporate America. So here the question is not necessarily of good and evil, but it's much more about where the goods go, both in terms of the literal goods, material goods, but also in terms of where the, you know, positive consequences of those actions lead. And I think that's been fundamentally objectionable to those who hold the status quo and feel it leaving, those who have their eyes on a different status quo that is not necessarily the same, or not a different status quo, but a different order of being from the old status quo. So if you have a capitalist order in South Africa that the ANC danced with for 23 years, and for 20 of those years danced with quite successfully, being replaced by a different order that's capitalism in a different way. A whole group of people who've become increasingly impoverished, so the poverty statistics have gone up, the inequality statistics have gone up, have not gained from the first dance, and are certainly not gaining from the second dance, even though that faction that is implicated is suggesting that the second dance is really the redressing of poverty. If in that complicated environment you sit with a multiplicity of players, who is good and who is evil depends on what your position is. And your position isn't necessarily one of knowledge, but it's also one of interpolation and your understanding of the world as it has been given to you through the various propaganda means. So if you have a public broadcaster that is, and here we're bleeding into that lane that you told Kuseni to get out of, but if you have a captured public broadcaster, the kind of information that you have available to ordinary citizens to decide about what is good, what is evil, what is in their interests, or what is not, that is compromised. And if you then have counter-narratives that say certain kinds of media information is necessarily white monopoly capital control, they don't have the means to object to that. Because if you've also, over 20 years, actively, and we can no longer deny that it was active, crippled the basic education system, compromised the higher education system by weird funding and by, you know, all sorts of other compromises, you don't have a critically literate population who can stand aside and go, it is not good and evil, but to ask questions about what is in my interest. And that population would include sometimes business people, because the people who sit in businesses aren't not citizens, aren't not also blinded by ideology and blinded by bad education.
Thank you. In a very important South African language, they'll say, "Nee, daai ou is baie slim." Nee. Others will say, "Boer my firmak plek." He used some Mugabe words there, you know, like some big English words that I must go and investigate what their true meaning is and decode you, Mr. Fick. So if I can pick up on that lane that you've now moved us into, the political lane, and then ask you, Jacques, to reflect on, do you think the political argument that was picked up in an earlier report post the state capture written by various academics across the country called the Betrayal Report, where they argue that what we're looking at here is not part of the points that Colin made. It's not a criminal project. It is truly and firmly a political project. Do you buy that? And are you sympathetic?
No, but I would quickly like to respond to what has been said very quickly.
Yes, by these gentlemen.
Yes.
That's very nice.
I often think that, that both politicians and business people are as honest as they are allowed to be. Because where you're dealing with money, you're also dealing with greed. And I think we find greed on both sides. We must remember that that government, and especially the state-owned enterprises, primarily deal with the private sector. You know, I think it was earlier this year or late last year, Popo Molefe, who became the chairperson of PRASA, gave a whole stack of files to the Hawks in which there were fraud of 19 billion rand that they have uncovered through their forensic experts.
How many zeros is that? 19 and many zeros.
It's like, I don't know, 19 billion rand of fraud. And
10 zeros.
And he said to the Hawks, investigate this, which they never did because they don't have the capacity to do it. But in any case, that fraud was committed and the collusion was between officials and the private sector. If you look at what an organization like KPMG, for example, did, when they did their 20 million rand plus investigation for SARS, you know, at some point the SARS attorneys write a memo to KPMG. And they say to KPMG, we would like you to include the following in your findings. And it's about 3 pages, a 3-page memo, which is terribly written with full of grammatical errors. KPMG copied and pasted that letter into their final report. They didn't even correct the grammatical errors. I mean, that's how bad they were. You know, and it's easy to try and blame everything on government and on the current situation. But if you think back about the collusion of the big construction companies during the 2010 World Cup, there was tremendous collusion between Stefanuti Stocks and Group 5 and all of them. They all colluded. With the building of the stadiums, there were billions and billions and billions of fraud. The Competitions Commission investigated, but they never released their report either. It's confidential. We can't get hold of it, and they imposed their fines. There was an advocate sitting in the NPA, Glynis Breitenbach, who was the head of the Economic Crimes Unit in Gauteng. She wanted to charge them. She was ready to go for them. And then she was removed because of other political factors. And a man by the name of Merwebi took over, who was so useless, he just never got to it. But there's also, you know, there's also examples of business. What I'm saying is we can't always blame government. We can't always blame Jacob Zuma for everything that goes wrong. You know, we must also look at the private sector and their collusion with state-owned enterprises and with government. It comes from 2 sides.
Thank you.
Government does business with the private sector, and I think they are as guilty, and they're also getting away with it.
So maybe by the end you might just say it once, President Zuma, but we don't know. We'll get there. Adam, if I may ask you to consider this. I saw a video of Mr. Brian Molefe talking to an ANC gathering. And he says to this ANC gathering, you know, as a good revolutionary, as a disciplined, I'm paraphrasing, my words, not his, as a disciplined cadre of the movement, you are allowed to question the leadership, but not too much. Because we need to instill revolutionary discipline in our environment, in our movement, because we deploy you. And later, when the leadership deploys, it's dealing on a much broader macro scale. They can't explain all the macro issues to you. They just need to give you the piece that makes sense to you. because sometime in the future they may be able to reveal it to you. Right? So this political project is premised on this notion that at the top, there are these leaders that make a lot of sense. They know exactly what they're doing. And then you, Brian, are deployed to do that part, and you, Adam, are deployed to do that part, and you mustn't question that. So within that context, would that be helpful in helping you to advise your clients, or for you to make sense if you were to look at this equally as a political project versus purely a criminal project? And if so, what kind of actions would you take going forward?
So, Morris, you're referring to Colonel Molefe, are you?
Yes.
Or, just to be clear.
Touché.
So, the way you describe it makes it sound like a set of ideals or a religion, a belief system that is being indoctrinated into the cadre deployed individuals that know and understand the agenda and believe very, very strongly in the execution of that agenda. I was saying to Jacques as we were preparing to come into the room, I really enjoyed on Thursday at the gathering, at the Daily Maverick gathering, watching Iraj Abedian with Jacques, and the man that was sitting in the middle was Jimmy Manyi. And there was a man very, very clearly who has an extremely strong belief system and a consistency around his perspective on what is right and wrong and what the political agenda and goal is. I guess the question that I have is, what's the end goal? What's the end objective? Because we can talk about radical economic transformation. We can talk about decolonizing the country and moving away from what Julius Malema, also at the same event, referred to as white monopoly capital, but said, went to great pains to say, when we say white, don't shift nervously in your seats. We don't really...
we don't mean it.
We don't really mean, you know...
We're just exaggerating
white.
for
It's
effect.
just, it's used as a...
Yeah.
And he quite clearly claimed that that WMC did not come from Bell Pottinger. In fact, it was a term that he invented and put into place. So these ideals, if we play them out in terms of the political agenda, what's the end result? Because at this point, the end result appears to be that they will destroy the very vehicle that has been attempting to develop and execute on that. Because at this stage, if they continue with that political agenda, then come 2019, there will be a very different reaction from the voters, because it takes the believers, or the religion has to convey its ideals, and the audience or the churchgoers need to buy into it and need to continue to make contributions to the offertory as it goes around in the church. And I think at this point the political agenda is looking to tear apart and factionalize the ANC, which I think is counter to the ideal or the objective that they're trying to execute on.
Thank you. Kuseni, we are sitting here in one of the richest 5 square kilometers on the African continent. We are, I dare say, elites reflecting on what's happening in our country. And I want to just imagine that this religion that Adam refers to, this belief system that some might have, that they're not really being criminal, they're actually doing good for society. Good for whom? Good for what, as Mr. Fick said. Let's imagine that we are all wrong, and it's now 2019, right? And if for lack of a better word, the Zuma faction continues and it wins in December, and then it wins the elections in South Africa in 2019. Right? What does South Africa look like at that point? No, at that point, it's the Zuma faction. At that point, it's 2019. They've won. It's no longer President Zuma. I do. It's the Dlamini Zuma faction. The President Dlamini Zuma faction has won, and let's argue that we buy the logic that President-elect Dlamini Zuma is a continuation of the current policies. Now, everything with that we thought was bad and couldn't happen, those elites in this room, has now happened. All right? And the ANC not only wins, it wins handsomely. And it only leaves that foreign country called the Western Cape to think about later on, but it's regained its strength everywhere else. What is South Africa like for business and for us elites at that point?
That's a great question.
Don't Goldman Sachs me, please. Just go straight into the question.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question to start looking forward. I still have faith in the institutions that underpin our democracy and our economy. I also think that I'm a skeptical optimist. The optimist part of the skeptical optimist in me seems to think that we'll emerge very strong out of 2017 with the Gupta leaks, with the discourse around state capture. I think as we enter 2018, we'll enter into a cleanup mode. I think people will say never and never again. And the ANC knows that the stakes are very high. If it continues on the path of corruption, it has to decouple itself from the corruption narrative so that it can regain the trust and confidence of the public. And the surveys that are out there, I think the scenario you've highlighted with the ANC winning, I'm sure people at Little House would like that. But there's a lot of work I'd like to argue that needs to be done really to salvage the damage that has been done to brand ANC. And what is required from the new administration is really strengthening and deepening the efficacy and integrity of our institutions. We need our justice system to continue to do the impeccable job it has been doing. We need our media to continue to be fearless, objective, impartial. We need our state security apparatus to be full of men and women of integrity who are there to do their jobs without fear or favor. I'm very optimistic that by 2019 we'll be in a better space than we are now. But that will not just happen. It requires all of us here in this room to really engage with the issues that confront our country. We're sitting in this richest square mile in Africa. We are a combination of a political and economic elite that is increasingly disconnected with the reality facing ordinary people out there. Hence, we have seen fees must fall. We've seen roads must fall. We've seen a lot of protests, every day there are protests throughout the country. The elites is out of touch with the reality that is facing people. Hence, you saw in the UK with Brexit, you saw in the USA Trump sweeping into power in the White House. We should be having these discussions in Alexandria, I'll suggest, next year when we have this, so that we can engage with the ordinary people on the ground and have them being part of the discussions here.
That's an invitation. Are you going to join us in Alex? Yes. Thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. 2 weeks ago, there was a very intimate conversation happening in this very room between Professor Nick Benadel and former Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan. And people were very animated about what Mr. Gordhan said until he got to this one point where he spoke about radical economic transformation. And I could just see people saying, "Where's the door? We thought you were one of us. What are you talking about?" So it seems like this term of radical economic transformation can be owned by forces in the light and forces in the dark. So I would like you, Colin, to reflect on radical economic transformation as part of this political project and how you think going forward business should be thinking about it. Should we really run for the nearest exit when we hear that term, or should we, like Sandberg say, lean into it? Lean into radical economic transformation and be part of the solution. What are your thoughts?
First thing I want to say is there is a disturbing narrative about the 23 years in South Africa that I just want to touch on. When we say inequality has got worse in South Africa, it doesn't mean that the poor have got less poor. It may mean, and I think as the facts suggest this, that the poor have got poorer. Sorry, the poor have got less poor, but at a slower rate than the wealthy have got more wealthy. Okay, just think about that. The amount of wealth in South Africa is unbelievable. It's incredible amount of wealth. White South Africans have got the biggest slice of the peace dividend in the post-apartheid period. Black South Africans have done extremely well. Black middle class has been created. Many wealthy black South Africans have been created. The poor have done well because they have got less poor through social grants, through distribution of state resources, and so on and so forth. But they have done less well than their middle class and their wealthy counterparts. So inequality has got worse. But it's really important to understand this point because that's what underlies the deepest problems that give rise to state capture. Why do I say that? Because poverty in South Africa is still 50%. You have a rising unemployment to 28%, but it flatlined like an ECG that was a dead patient for 20 years at around 24% unemployment. But the fact is we have a racial skewing of the poverty, those people, the face of poverty, the face of unemployment is black. And so this creates this problem. We have this legacy that is from an apartheid system that we've been living with. But I just want to say, when you talk about radical economic transformation, it's not like there hasn't been progress in the first 20 years. The last 3 years have been a very big disappointment in terms of growth, unemployment, poverty, alleviation, all the data have been going in the wrong direction. But for the first 20 years, there was a very significant amount of progress. So radical economic transformation today, there are two kinds of narratives. There's the Dlamini Zuma narrative, who stood on the stage here. I read her speech at Gibbs, in which he said, we must get rid of the independence of the South African Reserve Bank. We must distribute land, restitution of land without compensation, which is anti-constitutional. And she talked about white monopoly capital. I read her speech today, and so on and so forth, and talked about radical economic transformation in that context. It amounts to, and she said as much, distributing the current pie to more people in the black community. The Cyril Ramaphosa New Deal talk speech in Soweto that I was present at was a speech in which he talked about accelerating growth and transformation, both accelerating growth and transformation. Now, business is completely comfortable with accelerating growth and transformation, but there's no transformation that can take place in a context of no growth, because there won't be the means to facilitate that transformation and the resources. And so you have these two ideas of what transformation, radical economic transformation is. It's an important concept, and I think business, I'm part of Business Leadership South Africa's board, we talk about this a lot. There's no question that in the Integrity Pact, talking about what Jacques said earlier about business, we've produced that in order to lay the ethical foundations for the future about how business conducts itself. But we're also talking about giving content to transformation and growth in South Africa in such a way that we can be part of that journey.
Thank you for staying in the lane. And Mr. Fick, if I may ask you maybe to put a justice lens on that, and I mean it in the context of not Justice Malala, but in your theoretical sense, to say there's two ideas of cakes. There is, let's distribute the current cake argument that Colin, we just want to build on that, or let's grow the cake, actually more like bake a bigger cake, and then distribute more of that. Now, it sounds to me like in the spirit of justice that says, I'm white, I have what I have, I'm comfortable, I don't want to give up what I have. All right? So in order for me to share with you, Mr. Fick, because you're black, I kind of need to build something else, then we can share that. But this that I have, I don't want to give up. Right? I might be misrepresenting you, Colin, I understand, but I'm just exaggerating for effect, like Trevor Noah said. And so I wonder if you think this kind of exaggeration that I've put out there may well be part of this political project to say, hang on, it's not right. What you have as business is ill-begotten gains, like Henny van Vieren said in his book, right? And therefore, you kind of need to give something back. You need to share the current cake, and part of the legitimate way of sharing the current, of building a future, is for you to give something up. And yet we're hearing in business saying, hang on, I'm not going to give up. I want to help build, but I want to hold on. Do you see a fracture here between what this political case might be and possibly how business is experiencing the political argument?
Well, I can't really speak for how business experiences it, since I'm not in business. I would hate to ventriloquize. I can't really tell what business is thinking, since I'm not in business. But as someone who observes and lives in South Africa, I think we need to make a distinction between the declared and the manifest objectives that people have. The declared objectives is what we get in the business press, is what we get from people who sit in fora and tell us what they believe. Manifest objectives is what ordinary people are going to judge you on, which is the historical record. So I don't believe that when people talk about this as a political project and the interest of justice, that their actions back up that this is just a political project. I think it's also a criminal and self-enriching project. So I no longer believe that history is made by individuals. So this pill that people swallowed in the 1990s, that Nelson Mandela woke up one day in his cell in 1989 and said, let's change this country. That's not the case. It's not the case that what just happened in Zimbabwe either. Multinational interests drive the decisions and actions of people, even on the ground. And that relationship between government and business is a complex dance. So I would argue that if we go back in history in this country over the last 23 years, there is very little evidence for people sitting on the ground that business is interested in redressing. They have a truckload of evidence to the contrary. And they have it in those studies from the late 1990s where law graduates would complain that they weren't being hired, despite their marks out of UCT's law school, when it was still accredited, over their counterparts who got lower marks on a racialized paradigm. That black top graduates were not being partner hired and had to serve longer in pupillage and articles than white graduates with lower marks. The accountants complained about the same thing for years. So that is the record that black professionals have judged South Africa on and South African business on. They're judging South African black business on the same tokens. Who gets hired? It is not necessarily the person who's best fit for the job. It is the person who's going to do what is being tasked or touted as a political project. So when we look at contemporary South Africa's medium-term and longer-term future, unlike Kuseni, I don't have this positive outlook in the short-term future. I think the short-term future is messy, it's awful, it's disastrous. But precisely the dynamics of a young country, where the majority of people who live here under 35, means that come 2019, it is the last grandstand of the old men in this country. They don't have beyond 2019. So regardless of whether that faction, the NDZ faction, if you think of that as a faction, wins in 2019, 2024, which is the medium term, looks very different. And we've learned this lesson in 2016, when urban dwellers in a very fast urbanizing country taught the governing party a vicious lesson in at least 3 of the metropoles.
Allow me to translate. By 2024, the majority of voters were not born in 1994. Right? 1.
And 2, by 2040, which is when the 2030 goals have already failed, and the 2063 goals that the AU seems to want to
And
implement.
hopefully we're not here at that point.
No. We'll be
you
here.
And I, Mr. Fick.
I will be here.
Yo.
If I look, my father's 87. I don't
Okay.
know how old you are, but and how old your father is. My sense is I'm around, so I can't plan for a world in which I'm not.
Yeah.
I have to plan for my old age and think about what are these young people. And this is my last point here. Who are we listening to? Because it's not always clear that we're listening to the right people. We often speak in echo chambers, which explains what went wrong in the 1990s. The people in this country who had power listened inside echo chambers to other people who had power and weren't paying attention to those protests by millions of poor people that started in 1995 and thought, those are just horns blowing outside the wall. Well, that's what the people of Jericho thought, and look at them now. They're still listening only to the inside of the walls and not the outside. And I think what those young people in 2015 indicated to South Africans was time is up. Now the question is, who do you listen to? Do you listen to those who are behind the criminal project? Do you listen to those who facilitated a criminal project for a very long time? Or do you listen to the people who will make up the majority of the population, the market, the professionals, who have been complaining for 23 years that things are not going their way? And that, I think, is crucial because, again, a warning was sounded. The US Army Engineering Corps sent somebody to South Africa who looked at Eskom and warned his clients, don't touch that with a barge pole. But did we listen to him? No. We listened to the faction that would give us the interest, that would make the money, which explains why McKinsey is and was in the position that it is, among many other people for whom the ESCO domino race has not finished yet. Those dominoes are continuing to fall as these hearings in Parliament continue.
Thank you. Can we give them a round of applause, please? We are done with our echo chamber, and I would now like to open it up to our chambers. Rules of engagement. There are very few times when I'm in charge, and so when I get it, I really embrace it. And if I have to, I'm willing to put my wife into exile to hold on to power. So the rules of engagement are, we can ask any question, but all of it respectfully. And my panelist here can either choose to lean into your question or lean away from your question. So we'll take 3 questions at a time and you can either direct it to everyone or to a specific person. Show of hands, please. Okay, and then please introduce yourself. So there are 3 are going to be on this side, then I'll move to this side, then I'll move to that side. So introduce yourself. It's 1, 2, and you, sir, with the white shirt at the back, 3.
Thank you. My name is Angel Jones from Homecoming Revolution. My question is around the concept of what I believe is possibly growing racism in the country, and where the solutions we believe could be. Is it wishful thinking that South Africa, because we are so diverse, could be the ones to bring real change and real evolutionary examples of crossing that divide?
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks, Angel.
Hi, my name is Pippa Allen. My question really refers to the impact that the changes that happened in Zimbabwe and what kind of impact are they going to have on South Africa?
Thank you, Pippa.
My name is Bongani. My chronological order might be incorrect. Exxaro decided to reduce its exposure to energy coal. Eskom, Anglo-American came along and sold off its energy coal assets linked to Eskom. BHP left South Africa, offloaded to South 32. Yesterday, South 32 will offload its energy coal assets. They all claim that energy coal has become less sexy. Is energy coal that is less sexy, or it's South Africa that is less sexy? And is there enough money within South Africa to invest in the development of those mines to continue to supply the ever-hungry Eskom for the coal required to produce the electricity essential for economic growth?
Thank you. So before I open it up, they're more than welcome to. But Pippa, if you have time, come on Friday morning. We have a Zim talk with Dr. Nkosana Moyo, former Zimbabwean Minister of Economist, and is currently a presidential candidate in the elections next year. Professor Arthur Mutumbara, former Deputy Prime Minister in Zimbabwe. ex-colleague, Mr. Fungai Tarira. He's an asset manager. He runs his own business. And our colleague, Diana Games. And they'll be talking about where to from here. Zimbabwe, where to from here. But I'm sure my colleagues are more than welcome to lean into that question as well. So perhaps we could work our way backward and end off with an identity question. And I'm going to throw the SARS 32 question at you, Kuseni. The mineral energy complex.
Bongani, that's a very good question that you've asked. The mining industry is in a state of flux. Major mining houses such as BHP, Billiton, Rio Tinto, and Anglo-American are being forced by this or that reason to review their portfolios. The issue of energy coal is center stage in the global green economy debate and the Paris Climate Change Agreement recently signed. You find certain financial institutions, they actually exclude energy coal-related projects from their funding mandates. And you also find certain shareholders who are sensitive to green issues also exclude coal-related projects due to their commitment to a clean global green economy. So I think there is an element of truth that maybe energy coal is not as sexy as it used to be. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Incidentally, you are live as we speak on YouTube, so it's important that they hear you in the conversation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, I would say there is an element of having worked for Anglo-American. I've been part of those discussions at an ex-core level globally in terms of looking at long-term portfolio structure, but I'm not speaking on behalf of any mining company here. I'm just speaking as an observer myself of the mining industry and having been part of it. Is South Africa not sexy? I think South Africa's got challenges. It's a mixed bag. There are certain sectors that feel, especially the mining sector, investor confidence is very low, simply because of the issues around the mining charter, the bad relationship between the Chamber of Mines and the Minister of Mineral Resources. I believe that must be rectified, and we need to restore investor confidence. We are seeing some investors coming into South Africa. Ford Motor Company, just this past week, announced 3 billion rand investment into their plant. You're having other global automotive OEMs also investing. So it's a mixed bag. We do need to deal with local and foreign investor confidence, but some investors who understand the South African opportunity very well, they actually look beyond the noise. They cut through the clutter. They take a long-term view. They still see South Africa as a gateway into the African continent. I know there's a big debate about that. But in the long term, in the medium to long term, I think South Africa is still in a good space. We just need to talk with one voice. We need business and government to work together to restore the faith of the international and local investor community. Regarding Pipa's question on Zimbabwe, I think the recent developments can only be better for South Africa. If Zimbabwe normalizes, democratizes, stabilizes, get back to law and order, respect human rights, I think investors are waiting in the wings to go back and invest in that country. The key issue is whether we are going to see institutions being built. You can remove one person, as indeed they have done so. Are they going to start rebuilding strong institutions that can underpin stability in that country in the medium to long term? Let's wait and see. Maybe Friday will reveal that.
Colin, do you want to lean into Zim as well?
No, I'll talk about the identity issue.
Okay, go for it.
If you like. I mean, I would summarize it as follows. We have to fight for the Rainbow Nation. We have to fight for the Mandela spirit. The Mandela spirit is under threat because the exclusion and the marginalization of these communities, as I said, poverty has a black face, unemployment has a largely black face in South Africa, and as a consequence, we are what I call the two-speed society, where we have a quite non-racial, well-off black urban society in which people are doing quite well and part of the growth. And then we have this massive army of unemployed in these rural and peri-urban communities where there's hopelessness and marginalization side by side. And we have this environment where it's side by side. And in a context of lawlessness where the appearance of a state that is lawless and there are no consequences. Jobo Mbuza always talks about the fact that there's no consequences. You know, Mcebisi Jonas goes on national television and says, I was offered 600 million rand by this family to become finance minister. It in and of itself should be sufficient reason to arrest people for that act and hold them accountable, but nothing happens, no consequence. So if you don't have a job and you're seeing this wealth amongst your neighbors, whether white or black, in Sandton and Morningside and Bryanston and so on and so forth, why should the state and the leadership of the state be lawless? And you should respect the rules when, you know, you can go and commit crime and so on and so forth, apparently without consequence. So we have to fight for a country where laws return, institutions return, leadership is returned, and we get a non-racial team. And you know, South Africa has the most incredible people, the most incredible leadership across unions, across business, across government, across the judiciary, across, I hate to say it, the media. That's probably a headline tomorrow. And we have this incredible leadership across all these sectors. So we have this pool of talent that, you know, with the right leadership, we can pull together and we'll be in a dramatically different place. All you have to do is go to Paris and feel the difference of the post-Macron environment to the pre-Macron environment to understand how sentiment can change like that. And I can tell you, I believe with the Cyril Ramaphosa presidency in January, February next year, sentiment in this country, investment can change on a dime. And you will get unity, and your homecoming revolution will truly have momentum.
Lovely. May I invite the South Rand to contribute?
Excuse me, sorry, Maurice. May I just say one thing on the racial issue?
Point of order, comrade. Point of order, but go for it. Point of exigence.
Yeah, Angela, I think you raised an important point. Just one point I want to raise. We need champions of an inclusive society across sectors of our society. We need prominent white people who will stand up and really agitate for the spirit of reconciliation and unity, as Madiba did. We need prominent politicians in the black community to do that. Unfortunately, that is missing. There is no leadership. So in a word, I think it's leadership, leadership, leadership that is inspiring, that is inclusive, that embraces the right norms and values of the new South Africa.
Fortunately, my Tsotsis are saying wonderful stuff, so you can say something as well.
In that case, Angel, that, and with the greatest respect to the more experienced people in the audience here, that I believe that racism has a tendency to surface as one gets older in years. And I would defend that because I would tend to project a view that racism in youth is not something that is present. And I think we have to rely and believe that our youth are going to lead us forward, and that we have a situation where on the continent we have a demographic of the youngest age profile in the world, and yet we have a demographic of the oldest leadership in the world. And I think it's time that we convince our older leaders to hand over the baton to a younger group of individuals, and I think that is what's going to stem the flow and the upswing, because I think some of our older leaders tend to use it to political advantage.
Julius Malema has been asking that for quite some time. It's only fair to let everybody else speak on this. How dare you? But thank you. Go for it.
Just a quick thing. So it's interesting in South Africa that there's this exceptionalism around a whole lot of questions, and racism is one of them. It's as if South Africa continues to believe that it doesn't participate in a world where racism is in resurgence. And it's a white supremacist racism in resurgence, precisely because we're now at the end of that period where the people who survived the thing that ended racism in the global scale, that led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the people who survived the Holocaust are disappearing. The Holocaust's history is disappearing, and the history of colonial violence and its consequences is being denied, right? So in Africa, the Holocausts that we have had are not being claimed. We're being told they didn't happen. They weren't Holocausts. and the Holocaust of the Second World War, the Shoah, that is being deleted from everyday life. So there's that happening. But also, I think in South Africa, there's also a kind of mismemory of what the 1990s were. The failure of the Rainbow Nation project, and this is where I have to disagree with Colin, is precisely what the younger people of South Africa have objected to. That Nelson Mandela's Rainbow Nation vision, the Desmond Tutu argument for that vision, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, those have spectacularly failed to bring about the fruits that many people assumed they would bring in the second Thabo Mbeki presidency that was cut short. So I don't think that going back to that is necessarily a step in the right direction, because that project failed South Africans across the board spectacularly. It failed white South Africans and it failed black South Africans. Let's not forget that in that project, there was a moment where Alex Boraine and other prominent white South Africans suggested that white South Africans take some sort of symbolic approach of taking responsibility for apartheid. And people objected vociferously, to the point where Zapiro, who is now celebrated, drew a cartoon of a blank page saying, white people's petition taking responsibility for apartheid. So let's not romanticize the 1990s as this Rainbow Nation project. They were spectacular failures. Secondly, I think we...
What are your views, Meneer?
Well, I think first, when we look at Zimbabwe, for example, I think, you know, and many people are asking the question, what does Jacob Zuma think about Zimbabwe?
Yeah,
well, how does it impact on him? President Zuma.
Yes!
I did say Jacob Zuma. Anyway, what does he think about Zimbabwe and how does it impact on him? I think for the moment he must be quite relieved. There you had Robert Mugabe, who was unseated by the military, or not by the military, depends on who you believe. He got amnesty and a bag full of money, and his cronies are reappointed in government. Doesn't look as though that much is going to change. And I think it's a very, very bad example for Africa, because it doesn't look to me as though it's going to get much better. Mnangagwa is a hawk. He's got a terrible reputation. And this is the last thing we want to see. I mean, everybody wants to see Mugabe gone, but they don't want him to be seen. They don't want Mnangagwa, for example, to replace him. One hawk replaces another hawk. It's like Jacob Zuma stepping down and David Mashlobo takes over. I mean, it's not going to make a hell of a difference. So I'm not sure about Zimbabwe. I mean, you know, I think we have to see how things go. But I think the early signs are certainly not good. You know, when people talk about racism, I think in many ways President Zuma has been partly responsible for introducing the concept of racism once again into politics and into institutions. You know, if you look at SARS, for example, at the Revenue Service, before the end of '94, SARS was a brilliant organization. They didn't just meet their targets every year, they surpassed their targets. It was the organization of Pravin Gordhan and of Opa Magashule and of people like Ivan Pillay.
2014.
2014, sorry, yes. It's 2014. It was a brilliant organization. They went after the likes of organized criminals. They went after the likes of British American Tobacco. Brilliant. Then Jacob Zuma appointed a prisons boss as the commissioner of SARS, a man who knows absolutely nothing about tax. Within sort of like a period of a few months, he got rid of the legacy that Pravin Gordhan had built at SARS. And he appointed some terrible managers. I mean, his second in command has been stuffing cash into the ATM into his account, for example, and nothing happened. You know, there are big tax evaders. Somebody like Mr. Robert Wang, who owes R1 billion in tax, are getting away with it because he's not pursuing them because of their political connections. SARS is having a shortfall of R50 billion this year. They had a shortfall of 30 billion rand last year. And I think the immediate future looks extremely bleak, because what are we going to do if we can't fill the fiscus? What are we going to do if we're going to get to a point, because we must now find 50 billion. How are we going to find it? I don't know. But we have to find 50 billion, and it might even be more. What is going to happen the day we can't pay social grants, for example? We pay 17 million social grants every month. If Dlamini Zuma becomes, Dr. Dlamini Zuma becomes the
For you.
the ANC president in December, we might enter a nuclear deal that's going to cost R1 trillion. You know, a few years ago, we were still talking about corruption in terms of millions. Then came the arms deal. Then we got into the billions. The nuclear deal might come, and we're going to get into the trillions.
You're being too personal now. We're not talking about trillion anymore.
And I think that's the problem we're facing.
So we are nearing 7:30. Before I do, I've got one question that I prepared for you, Jacques, which is, what is wrong with you? What motivates you to go after these people? Do you not fear for your life?
No.
Just help us get into your mind. Help us to understand what motivates you to go after. I mean, even thinking of mentioning these names gives me the chills.
Everybody asks me, and I don't quite know how to answer it. You know, I left journalism at the end of 2014 to become a chef. But in December last year, when I got that call from someone who said to me, I've got information for you about corruption in state security, but you have to go to Moscow to go and see someone, whatever. I said to someone the other day, it was a bit like I'm a rehabilitated heroin addict. You know, and someone...
You're also from Woodmead.
Yes. And someone handed me a syringe full of heroin, and I couldn't help inject myself. Because that's journalism. I mean, there sits another journalist over there, and ask him. It stays in your blood. Doesn't go away. Couldn't help myself.
Well, thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, do you want to spend more time? So let me take 3 questions on this side and 3 questions on that side, and be quick about it. No speeches, questions. Let's see. There was a hand here. 1, 2. Okay, that's, am I seeing one? Right at the top. Okay, great. Go for it.
Okay, gentlemen, this is to all of you. Based on everything that's been coming out of the woodwork, Joanne from Bank South Africa. Just based on everything that's come out of the woodwork, the Gupta leaks, the books that have been coming out, my big question that I'm sort of trying to get my mind around, and possibly you would have some insight, is this going to stop? Are people going to be held accountable? And are we going to see people being arrested and put behind bars? Because otherwise, what is the point?
Well, I think a lot of...
Okay, Meneer, I'm going to collect all the questions. I'm going to run this way. There we go. Sit down for me.
My name is Tony, and this, I suppose, is to Colin specifically. With Moody's, the outlier currently, what's the impact?
Thank you, Tony. And then one more over there. I'm in Alex now.
Hi, I'm Tlokomelo Mokhale from Investec Bank, and my question is directed to Jacques. So in your book, you highlight the role that the Sunday Times played in the systematic breakdown of SARS. And to me, it seems like they were never held accountable. Every Sunday, you know, they keep publishing and people still, you know, eat up their stories. In the era of fake news, how do we then trust the media if nobody's holding them accountable?
Thank you. I think go for it. Start answering while I go to the other side. Go.
Should I start? The first question. Are they going to be held accountable? Is it going to change? I think a lot depends on who wins in December. I'm afraid if Dr. Dlamini Zuma wins, very little is going to change. Look at the people she's surrounding herself with. David Mabuza, Ace Magashula. Not pretty people. And I think very little will change. And I think it's going to be dire if she comes to power, because I think she's relatively weak, and I think she's compromised. If any of the other candidates come to power, it will still take a hell of an effort to turn the law enforcement agencies around. I've just mentioned SARS. How do you build that capacity in SARS again? You know, it's very difficult to get rid of civil servants. Very difficult. You need lots of money. You suspend them and they sit at home for a couple of years earning their salaries. So how do you build, for example, the capacity in SARS again? Those skilled people, those experts are gone. I don't know whether we can get them back again. So we mustn't think that everything is suddenly going to change if we get the right candidate or the right ANC president. It's going to take a long, long time, and it's going to take lots of political will to charge people. There's lots of rot in the police. There's lots of rot in the intelligence services. We have to weed them out. It's going to take time. It's not easy.
Sunday Times.
Oh, the Sunday Times. You know, I would have liked, you know, when the Sunday Times ultimately apologized for their wrong reporting. But it was quite a hollow apology because nothing happened to the journalists. You know, there were three culprits, 3 journalists. One of them is still working for the Sunday Times. The other one is now working for Business Day. And the third journalist miraculously got a few million rand to launch his own newspaper. And interestingly, guess who, that's Peter Ampedi. And guess who launched his newspaper? Faith Mutambi. So where did the money come from? So anyway, nothing has happened to those journalists. I think it should have been a more transparent process whereby there were disciplinary hearings and whereby the results were made public. I think the Sunday Times handled it to an extent, but I think we should have had more. Can we trust the media? It's a very difficult question. You know, it also depends on where you stand at the moment. I mean, there's some people who watch ANN7 and they believe what they see. You know, so yeah, it's a difficult. You know, it's difficult. I think there has been a recovery in the media. I think at the end of 2014, for example, when I left, journalism was in a terrible state. You know, you had the Sunday Times, SARS broke unit stories and whatever. I think the media has made a comeback. If you look at the Gupta leaks, for example, there is new expertise in journalism. If you look at publications like Daily Maverick, for example, that have done excellently, Business Day, really credible publications. So I think the media is stronger now than they certainly were a few years ago, but I think they need to be more transparent about what is going on.
So the scary thing is that you left in 2014, it went down, so please don't leave for a long time. So
can I deal with the Moody's question?
Can I just take 2 questions and you can come back with that? I just want to close it out, then you can have the Moody's question.
Thank you. My name is Khalaboy. I just want to let you on the discussion earlier around credible leadership in South Africa. I think in the last few years, one of the key comfort we're giving ourselves as South Africans is that we can never be like Zimbabwe because we have credible leadership and because we've had the benefit of learning from the rest of the continent. And this being a discussion about foresight, one of the questions I've been asking myself is, do we actually have the right thinking about understanding the challenges that we face? Because it seems to me that none of us actually anticipated that we'll be where we are with Zuma. I'm not sure that I can't call him president, I apologize. I can't help but believe that none of us expected that we'll be where we are with Zuma. And I can't believe that it's a simple political project because he's out of control, not even to his party. So the question I'm actually really asking is twofold. One, do we actually have credible leadership in South Africa? Because we're still grappling with racism. I don't think we can blame it on Zuma. And secondly, do we actually have the right thinking to look at the problems we face in South Africa? as opposed to just saying we won't be like the rest of the continent.
Thank you, Khalebo. And finally, save the best for last.
Thank you. My name is Tulebona. Mr. Coleman, how do we grow this pie to make sure that, I mean, we're not necessarily having a few black people moving in the middle class. We're not having white people at the top, and right at the bottom we have a majority of the black people who are still poor. Where to from here? Downgrade, junk status. Maybe you have an optimistic view about our presidential candidate, but I do still feel that we might have a bleak future. What is your take?
Wonderful. So what I would like to suggest, and Colin, then this is your swan song. You answer those questions and you give us your concluding remarks. Then we'll work our way through.
Okay. I mean, it's unfortunately fallen to me and a few people over the last 3 years under the CEO initiative in the post-Nenegate period to engage with the rating agencies. I've got to know Zuzana Brixova, the lead analyst of Moody's, who reviews the South African rating decisions of Moody's quite well. Java Mabuza and myself and Mike Brown have been very active around the rating issues. I would say there's one unifying principle for the rating agencies when they look at rating a country, and that is there a credible structural reform story that would suggest, not in the short term, but in the medium term, that there will be a turnaround in economic growth prospects? Because the economic growth story is what underlines your ability to deal with your debt. So with debt rising to 60% of GDP, according to the medium-term budget statement, that in and of itself, as is said in the rating agency reviews by Standard & Poor's and Moody's, is not at levels that should threaten South Africa, nor is the 10% of foreign currency reserves or foreign currency borrowing that South Africa has offshore, because 90% of our borrowing is South Africa. But rather the growing fiscal pressures and the underlying issues here are a deep concern for the rating agencies. And with it, the question is, what is the structural reform agenda? Now, unfortunately, a medium-term budget statement that effectively suggests below population growth, economic growth rates for the next 4 years is not a recipe for an investment-grade rating. As simple as that. And so, in many senses, it's a mistake to project to the world and want to retain investment-grade rating such a forecast. So the medium-term budget statement was effectively a recipe for a downgrade. Now, the question going forward is we have 90 days, effectively, between the rating announcement last week and the budget statement. And they were very clear, if you read the Moody's statement, that effectively they're watching two things. One is the political leadership choices in December and the candidates' electioneering and policy positions associated with those leaders. And secondly, what the budget presentation at the end of February 2018 looks like, and whether that presents a credible structural reform agenda for long-term positioning or medium-term economic growth recovery. And for now, and it links back to the last question, you know, effectively, I think that if the election of the leadership in December leads to a rapid and very intense high-energy turnaround plan with a transition put in place, including a potential recall of the president at that point, and a potential presentation of a credible economic turnaround, which has headlines including a removal of the Eskom board, the current Eskom board, a replacement of these boards, including the potential arrest of some of the culprits of state capture in the short term, and a presentation of an economic outlook that suggests that we get back to 3% economic growth in a short term and 5% in the medium term. I think that is the kind of structural reform package that could win us a reprieve. But anything short of that, in other words, a business as usual approach overlaid with a nuclear program, is absolutely a recipe for a downgrade. And let's remind ourselves, the fiscal cliff that comes with that downgrade is $10 billion of forced selling of the World Government Bond Index participants who have South African bonds. $10 billion, just to be clear, is about 50 cents on the rand move. It's not a major thing. But it will send a sort of butterfly effect of tremors down the economic chain, including the cost of capital, the cost of borrowing, and so on and so forth. That will be very, very negative. At the time of Nenegate, what we warned the ANC was the Brazil effect of allowing this situation to arise would effectively be a self-perpetuating negative decline in economic effects. And that's what we face to the extent that a downgrade occurs. It will be much more difficult for businesses to invest, much more expensive, and that economic confidence and sentiment that I talked about will be missing. And it's entirely in our grasp. If the country chooses the right political leadership, we can turn it around within the 90 days.
Thank you. Round of applause, please. Angela, I'm not sure whether you're going to agree or disagree. This is your turn just to close this out, please. Thank you.
Weren't there questions for Jacques?
No. He's going to answer them as we close out.
Cool. I think it's Khaleboe who asked the question about the rest of the continent. I think South Africans need to really ask themselves where they are and who they listen to. I remember coming back into this country and hearing the SABC3 weather reporter guy, who was a national treasure apparently at the time, saying, doing the weather and then saying, and for those of our viewers traveling to Africa. And coming here from having been born here, then having been transplanted, coming back, I thought, what does this man imagine the Limpopo River is? The Indian Ocean? We then sat with a president who made a joke in front of a university audience, and it was an elite university audience that likes to tell us it's in the top 3 in this country, in its main hall, and it said, we are not like other Africans generally. And the audience laughed. Some of them possibly nervously, but some of them got the joke because they believed they're not like other Africans generally. Now, other Africans generally have been warning us both vocally and by example of what we face, and not just the, oh my God, we're all going to become Zimbabwe phenomenon, but actually we were warned about xenophobic violence by other Africans, and we chose not to listen. We were warned about concentrating political power in one party and in one individual in that party by other Africans, and we chose not to listen. Once more, we are being warned by the rest of the continent, ordinary citizens who trade on the streets of Johannesburg, diplomats, academics, and we choose not to listen because we keep saying, but we're not like other Africans generally. And we say that in a variety of ways. We say that by saying, no, we have fancier buildings, we have stronger institutions, we have. And instead of looking at the Limpopo as the Indian Ocean, we might begin to look at it as a kind of mirror, which is there are possible futures ahead of us in South Africa. And instead of doing the psychiatric cabaret of our own exceptionalism, to look north and to say, what lessons can we learn there that are positive that we can institute here? What lessons can we learn there that we don't want to repeat? Because there's nothing sadder than the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte, which is to have history first repeat itself as tragedy and then as farce. We've had history repeat itself here as tragedy. It would be unnecessarily stupid for the educated elite of this country to repeat it as farce over the next 10 years. And my fear is that by consistently calling itself the exception to the rule, South Africa's elite is likely to repeat history as farce.
Yeah. Boa. Adam, I thought maybe, that was like proper English. Maybe you can respond.
But I can try. Today is the, the last exams in Matric 2017. So the season is closed now at this point. So there were 750,000 or so matriculants that have sat the exams in grade 12. In grade 1, out of 100 young people that started in grade 1, 60 of those young people will not get a matric. They'll not get a certificate. They'll not get a degree. They have nothing. And only 5 of them will go on to get a degree. And it's a shocking statistic for us. And I'd like to suggest the greatest motivator that we need to have to ensure that we engage as individuals. And that's everybody as individuals. That means each and every one of us, that we have a role to play in creating a future for the youth of South Africa. And right now, that future does not look good. And I think, similar to Angelo, the greatest threat to us is that if we don't react and do something and get involved, then those young people will indeed come and take what they want and what they need. And we will have a total implosion of our society. So best we wake up, we get involved, we don't wait for these processes and the movie that we can see unfolding in front of us. Each of us has a role to play in playing an active part in building our nation and stopping those that are destroying our nation.
This business school is starting to feel like a political school. Thank you. Kuseni, you may take anyone and close out.
My honorable friend Halebo, they raised a very important question around leadership. I think we have the leadership. We just need to make sure we create the spaces for them to emerge. We have good quality people in this country, in business, in politics. We just need the right men and women to emerge, to do the right things in society. I think also blaming government, it doesn't help. As business people, we need to roll our sleeves and do what it takes to grow the economy. South African corporates have over R1 trillion in their bank balances, which is not being deployed to invest in this country to grow the economy and generate jobs. The companies that I'm chairman of, Aspen Pharmacare and Massmart, I'm very pleased that we're actively investing in this economy. We're actively investing in young entrepreneurs who are building their own companies, creating jobs, supplying us with their goods, and also enabling them to export to the Walmart global supply chain. And I think it's the economy, as Bill Clinton used to say, is the economy stupid. We all need to focus on growing the economy, making sure it's inclusive, making sure that we can at least grow it around 5% so that we can start pushing back against unemployment, poverty, as well as inequality. I also think that as business people and as South Africans, we've got only one country. We can't determine our future based on who is president and who is not president. The responsibility we have is to rally around whoever emerges in a process that is fair and democratic and provide the support that they need in order to build the country. Unfortunately, business people don't vote at the ANC election conference. They have wishes on who should emerge. But once the process has been run, it is clean, it's credible, we have a duty to rally around whoever is the leader and make sure that we make South Africa great and we make South Africa a winning nation, as indeed I believe it can and must be.
Thank you. Meneer, there's no you.
You know, I think there's only 3 pillars standing between us and the country becoming a gangster state, a criminal state. The first one is the courts, and I think the courts have been acting magnificently. We've got a very credible High Court, we've got a very credible Chief Justice. The second pillar is the media, who has to expose, who has to inform. And the third one is civil society, that's people like me and you. We cannot afford to sit still anymore. We cannot afford to sit back and to wait for something to happen. And I think civil society has been acting wonderfully in the last year. If you think of organizations like Freedom Under Law, Corruption Watch, Helen Suzman Foundation, organizations like that. But I also want to add a fourth pillar tonight, and that's business. And not just not doing shady business with government or state-owned enterprises, but to distribute wealth and to bring wealth to ordinary people. That's the only thing that will save this country in the end.
Before I invite you to join us for cocktails, let me first begin by thanking every one of you gentlemen. The fact that the room continues to be full is a testament to this very important topic. And may we remember the people, our fellow South Africans, and put a face and a name to them as we journey forward. And before my next thank you, may I ask you to please give a round of applause, and I will thank the next person. And there I was thanking you for being such a wonderful participants and really making this fun and enjoyable. I just want to end off by referring to a quote that we're all too familiar with, which is, never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. Let freedom reign. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. God bless Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you.